I don't desire revenge, but I do ask for justice and to impose the maximum penalty as the law allows.
This is Russell Burrell. He is smiling here at the families of his victims before being sentenced to 6 life sentences. In 2012, he was one of 4 men who together planned to rob money and illegal narcotics from this man, Michael Martin. The robbery was seen as an easy job. They hoped to succeed quickly and escape with the goods. But as you can guess, this crime wasn't going to be as simple as just that. When the robbery went horribly wrong, this 16-year-old monster did the unthinkable, taking the lives of 3 people and then showing no remorse for his actions.
Every day comes with the struggle of having to walk past his bedroom door. Another day that she'll pass without hearing his voice or seeing a smile that would light up a room. There's a void and a hole and an emptiness in my life that will never be filled.
Let's dive right into this heartbreaking case of the 16-year-old who smiled while getting 6 life sentences in a row. Providence, July 2012. 4 young men sit around an apartment talking and making plans for the future, just like many friend groups do. What makes this conversation different from so many others are those plans involved robbing a known dealer of both his stash and his cash. Timothy DeBrito, Russell Burrell, Quandell Husband, and Donovan Hall were all scheming at the house of Sylvia Moorhead, who had mothered several children with DeBrito. Of the 4 men, Burrell and Husband were the youngest, both only 16 at the time. They came up with their plan to rob Michael Martin, considering him a pretty easy target, with only him and his girlfriend, Shamika Barros, expected to be at home. They were confident they could pull it off without a hitch and walk away a few $1,000s richer. But just in case things didn't go quite the way they planned, DeBrito had something in the apartment they could use as a backup, a decision that would change the lives of this friend group forever.
Detectives are working diligently the past several nights since the incident, and as soon as we have something to report, we will, and we're hopeful.
Each of the 4 men in that apartment had at one point been in control of the 9mm Glock they intended to take with them to the robbery. The weapon held 17 rounds and came with a laser sight, making this a truly lethal weapon indeed. It also came with a history of violence, being used for months across Providence in a reign of terror and death. They called it the community gun, and it had terrorized the local area in as many as 5 shootings in 5 months, as it was passed around friends like a toy. Victims were wounded or killed, and most shockingly, an apartment full of children was shot at using this gun. It's hard to think what kind of sick and twisted person it would take to do such a thing when there could be children inside. Even though these crimes are serious by themselves, they don't even come close to the most disturbing incident of all involving this particular 9mm Glock 17, a triple homicide.
He intended to rob them when he and 3 others burst into the General Street apartment and shot the victims.
Burrell, Husband, and Hall approached the home of Michael Martin at 151 General Street at around 10 p.m. on July 30th, 2012, with Burrell carrying the fully loaded Glock. They would pretend to be buying narcotics as a way of gaining quiet entry without causing a scene. When they entered, they encountered something they didn't expect: a 3rd person in the apartment. Damian Colon was a friend of the couple and had come to see them after his shift at work. They all went into the kitchen as Barrows slept in the living room, unaware of the imminent danger. Burrell pulled out the gun and demanded Martin hand over his stash of all of his money. For some reason, the shooting started and Martin and Colon were gunned down in a merciless act of evil. But this killing streak wasn't over yet. As Barrows woke and saw the horrific scene in front of her, she began to scream. Burrell took aim and silenced her forever, using the last of his bullets. Michael Martin, Damian Colon, and Shamika Barros all had their lives tragically taken for no apparent reason by a cold-blooded killer who was barely out of childhood. By mercy or miracle, Barros' 2 daughters, her younger brother, and her pet dog were all left alive, although no doubt traumatized from the ordeal.
As police continue searching for clues in Monday night's deadly shootings in Providence, loved ones are beginning to say goodbye to the victims.
Eventually, police made their arrests, but it wasn't Burrell that was identified as the shooter. It was Husband. Both him and DeBrito would go to trial in 2013, but there was one problem that first had to be solved. as husband was only 16 at the time of the murders.
One of the juvenile suspects accused of killing Shamika Barros, Michael Martin, and Damian Colon in July is going to be tried as an adult. 16-year-old Quandel husband was arraigned in district court this afternoon and charged with 3 counts of murder.
DeBrito also had a problem to worry about, one that could come with some pretty serious consequences. He'd already shot a man called Gary Ellerby just a few months before the murders. It was later discovered that Ellerby was a love rival of DeBrito, leaving a possible motive. This tricky case would end with DeBrito getting a 50-year stretch for shooting Ellerby and husband getting 2 life sentences after being found guilty of the triple homicide.
Well, I can tell you this was an emotional day in the courtroom. We're talking about 6 families here, 3 families for the accused and 3 families for the victims, and altogether 9 counts of murder.
But get this. Husband's legal team found they had grounds for an appeal, which of course they took advantage of. The appeal was based on evidence that his legal team said was unfairly submitted in his trial that was prejudice against the defendant. The evidence came from the incident with Ellerby. When Ellerby was shot in the back several times, it was with the community gun, the same one used by Burrell. It was alleged that Burrell was there when Ellerby was shot, watching and smiling in the distance. How was husband linked to the shooting? He wasn't, and that's part of the problem. Even though he wasn't at the Ellerby incident, a witness testified in court that the weapon had once been used in the hands of husband. Because of his association with those who were at the scene and the fact that he'd been in possession of the murder weapon at some point, it was allowed. This was no doubt to get an emotional response and make husband look like he was the kind of person who is capable of this kind of thing. But with the evidence admitted questionable, this case was far from over. It wouldn't take long before it ended up back in the court, where the authorities had their sights set on bringing the full weight of the law down on the one that pulled the trigger.
A murder conviction has been thrown out today. You may remember back in 2014, 18-year-old Quandel husband was sentenced to 2 life sentences for killing Shamika Barros, Michael Martin, and Damian Colon in a plot to steal money and drugs. But this morning, the Rhode Island State Supreme Court released a decision saying in part that some evidence came to light indicating that Quandel husband was not the shooter, but was nevertheless convicted of the murders.
In the end, it was the key witness that really brought this case together. Who was that witness? None other than Donovan Hall, who appeared to be having trouble living with what he'd done. After talking to his grandparents, Hall decided the right thing to do was to come clean and to do it on the witness stand. He testified his involvement in the planning, the carrying out, and covering up of the murders, implicating the other 3 men involved as well. Hall gave all the details the prosecution needed to prove Burrell was the shooter. After his cooperation with the law, he received 3 life sentences, meaning he might one day see freedom, but not for a very long time. Although husband had his prison time reduced after the new trial, he will still serve 2 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 10 years for his part in these horrific murders.
The man pleads guilty to charges connected to the killings of 2 men and a woman in a break-in.
As it turns out, Donovan Hall wasn't the only one willing to try and talk and get a reduced sentence.
In a plea deal with prosecutors, a Providence man who had been charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in a triple murder pleaded guilty this morning to 3 counts of second-degree murder. A judge then sentenced Timothy DeBrito to serve 40 years in prison.
Not only had Russell Burrell shown no remorse, witnesses say during his trial he smirked as he walked past the victims' families in a petty act of defiance.
Amid all the characters here, let us be clear. 19-year-old Russell Burrell, who was a juvenile at the time of the murders, was the one who emptied 17 rounds into 3 human beings.
While in court, he was made to face members of the families of those he had killed, and one of them told Burrell exactly what she thought of him.
You took the life of her son, my grandson, for what? You committed a horrible, evil act, murdering 3 precious persons, resulting from your sick soul. I don't desire revenge, but I do ask for justice and to impose the maximum penalty as the law allows.
For this unforgivable series of murders, Burrell would receive the longest and most deserved punishment.
Think of what one has to do to receive life in prison times 6 plus a decade more, and Russell Burrell did it. The 19-year-old sentenced in Superior Court Monday for murdering Shamika Barrows, Damian Colon, both 22, and Michael Martin, 23.
He will spend the rest of his natural life behind a prison cell with no chance of release, ever. With a sad, heartbreaking case like this one, it's difficult to imagine the pain and suffering both the relatives of the victims and the perpetrators have endured, and how they must live with what their own family members have done. 3 lives were needlessly taken by a man only just entering adulthood, with no thought for the consequences or respect for human life. For whatever reason, he decided to pull the trigger that fateful night, and he will have plenty of time to think about his actions during his lifetime of incarceration. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you can keep up with the most disturbing crimes the world has ever seen.